Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Storytelling is a form of communication that speaks to both mind and heart. It is an age-old expression and narration of life's laughs, loves, and mysteries. Every culture has used tales, fables, legends, and epics as a method of describing or teaching about what is enduring in the events and conditions of what it means to be human. Storytelling's beauty is how each individual culture embroiders and colors its tales, yet simultaneously unfolds its universal theme. Storytelling is a banquet where all are invited and none leave hungry. For decades, storytelling artist Benyam Van Hattum has delighted a wide range of audiences with his unique and unusual repertoire of tales from the world of Islam. In addition to being rich and entertaining, this program addresses the need to introduce audiences to an important and often misunderstood faith, and the need to promote understanding of the many diverse cultures represented within the world of Islam. So, enjoy traveling around the world with us on our narrative caravan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Once in the far land of Western China, there was a farmer. And this farmer owned a small farm. On one of his fields, he had a beautiful, beautiful stallion. And this stallion was worth everything to him, because it would take his cart to town, it would help him plow his fields, it would help him carry loads for him. But one day, there was a thunderstorm, and the thunderstorm came over, and there was a big, big thunderclap, and the stallion, it reared up, and it broke through the fence that surrounded the paddock, and it ran off across the steppes into the mountains. And the neighbor, he came out, and he saw the stallion running across the steppes towards the mountains, and he came up to the farmer and said, what a terrible thing, look at this stallion, you rely on it for everything, and now it's gone, what will you do? And the farmer looked at him and says, I don't know if it's for better or for worse, but Mashallah, that's the way Allah willed it, Mashallah. Well, the day went by and the next day came, and late in the afternoon at the next day, lo and behold, there, out of the mountains, came the stallion. And it wasn't alone. It had brought with him a wild mare. And it led the mare into the paddock, and there the farmer came, and he fixed the fence around the paddock, around the pasture. And there suddenly there was two horses, one a stallion and a mare. And the neighbor came out and says, what a lucky man you are, look at you. You have two horses now. If you tame that mare, you'll be able to do twice the work. You will be able to plow twice the fields, and you will be able to take twice the load to town. What a lucky man you are. And the farmer looked at him and says, I don't know if it's for better or for worse, but that's the way Allah willed it, Mashallah. Well, the next day it happened that the son of the farmer, he tried to break the mare, and as he was trying to break the mare and rode it, suddenly he was thrown off, and his leg was terribly broken in several places. And the neighbor came out to the farmer and says, look at this. What a terrible thing for your son. His leg is broken. This is going to take a long, long time to heal, and you won't have any help. What a terrible thing. The farmer looked at him and said, I don't know if it's for better or for worse, but Mashallah, that's the way Allah willed it, Mashallah. Well, it just so happened that a week later, messengers came from the king of that land, and they were rounding up all the young men to bring them to the army, to bring them to battle. And as the farmer and his neighbor stood there watching the neighbor's son being taken by the messengers to the army, the neighbor turned to his neighbor, the farmer, and said, oh, you're a lucky man. Your son's a lucky man. Look at him. His leg is broken in so many places that even the army won't take him. You're a lucky man. And the farmer looked at him and says, I don't know if it's for better or for worse, but that's the way Allah wanted it. Mashallah. And this story goes on and on and on, and you can take from it what you will. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Once there was a stonecutter, and this stonecutter worked very, very hard, cutting stone, chopping stone, and for little pay, and he was not contented. And day after day after day, he did his heavy labor, working, cutting stone. And he wished one day, as he saw a rich man passing by, he said, I wish I was a rich man. I wish I could sit like him in my room and have servants fan me so I can relax. And an angel from the heavens passed by and heard him and came to him and said, it will be as you wish. And suddenly there he was. He sat in this room. He was a rich man. And the servants stood by, and with palm fronds they cooled him down as he sat there. And he sat there for several days until one day the king of that country came by. And there, as he rode in his palanquin, and there were servants before him, there were soldiers behind him. And he looked at the king of that country and he said, Mashallah, look at that. This is a king. His heart was not contented. And he said, look, he has servants before him, soldiers behind him. He's being carried around. I wish I was the king. And the angel came and it heard him and said, okay, you will be a king. And there suddenly he was. He was the king. And he was being carried, and there were servants before him and soldiers behind him. And he sat there as the king in the courtyard, receiving his people. He sat there under the palanquin. And it was a beautiful sunny day. And as he sat there, the sun started beaming down on him. And it became hotter and hotter and hotter. And suddenly he started sweating. And he was not contented anymore as he looked up. Because there he looked and said, look, there is one that's mightier than I. It's the sun. I wish to be the sun. Well, the angel came down from the heavens and said, you will be the sun. And there he was the sun. He was there in the sky, beaming down on all the world. And he was drying up the waters. He was shriveling the plants. And everything sought shade under the trees. He was burning the trees up. People sought shade in their houses. Everybody fled before the might of his burning might of the sun. Until suddenly a storm cloud floated in through the heavens. And where the storm cloud was, his rays did not reach. And green grasses started growing again. And the cloud grew and grew and grew. And more grasses. And it started raining. And the cloud started raining and raining and raining. And wherever it grew, more and more greenery came up. And his rays did not reach. And he looked down at that cloud and said, look at that. There is one that is mightier than I. I wish to be that storm cloud. Well, there he was. The angel came down from the heavens and said, you will be that storm cloud. And suddenly there he was a storm cloud. And he floated over the land and it rained harder and harder and harder. And the rivers flooded and the creeks flooded and the people sought shelter in their houses on the high ground because so much water was coming down. And he rained harder and harder and everything floated away. And everything, it fled before his might. Until suddenly he came upon a large rock. And he rained down upon it harder and harder and harder and harder. But the rock did not move. And he threw all his might, his warrior might, onto that rock. But there it stayed and it did not move. And finally he looked at it and says, there is one that is mightier than I. I wish to be that rock. And the angel came from the heavens and said, it will be as you wish. And suddenly there he was that rock. And there he stood in his stony might, immobile. And everything passed by him had to go out of its way. It had to pass on his right, pass on its left. And there he stood in his stony might. And everything passed. Until one day, suddenly, at the foot of that stony might, he felt something. And there was a stonecutter that came up to the stone. And he took a chisel and he drove it into a wedge, a crack in the stone. And he started taking his maul and beating it and beating it and beating it, and suddenly a piece of rock came off and cracked off. And he looked worried and says, look at this one, he is mightier than I. And he said, I wish to be that stonecutter. And the angel came from the heavens, and it will be as you wish. And there suddenly he was. He was a stonecutter, and he worked hard, long hours for little pay. But from that day on, he was contented. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the early days of Islam, Sayyidina Ali had moved to Kufa from Medina after he became the Khalifa, and so it was the Khalifal city of Islam. And since it was the capital city, many people came from all over and settled in the city where the Khalifa lived. Now one day, as Sayyidina Ali was walking down the streets, he saw a servant girl sitting just outside the market, and she was crying and crying. And he looked at her and said it was his duty to look after all his people, and he cared for his people. He went up to her and says, tell me, girl, what happened? What's the problem? And she looked at him, and she did not know him, but he had a kind face as he looked at her, and she said, it so happened that I'm a servant girl to this merchant, and he sent me to the market to buy dates. And I bought him a bag of dates. And then I brought it home, but he did not like the dates. So he sent me back to the market, to the merchant who sold the dates. And I asked him to get the money back and bring the dates back. We hadn't taken one of the dates from it. And I came to the market stall, and he chased me away. He would not let me return the dates, take the money back. He chased me away. And now I'm here, because if I go home to my master, the merchant, he will beat me because I don't have the money. And if I go back to the market, he will also chase me away and chastise me. What am I to do? And Sayyidina Ali, he looked at him, come with me. And they walked into the market. And there they went to the dates, the date merchant stall. And the dates merchant, who had only recently moved to Kufa, in the market, in the souk, he stood there, and he did not know who Sayyidina Ali was. And there he saw the servant girl coming with a man beside them, who was supposedly to help him. And he started berating them because of what they wanted to do. Until finally somebody came around and told him who this was. This was not just anybody. This was the Khalifa. This was Sayyidina Ali. And as soon as he did, he ran from behind his stall, and he threw himself on the floor and said, pardon me. I did not know who you were. And Ali looked at him with great displeasure and said, but when it was an honest servant girl who wanted to return the wares, you didn't care. But now when it's power and authority over you, you throw yourself on the ground and rub yourself in the dust. And at that moment, the merchant who had heard about the servant girl and Sayyidina Ali taking her to the market, he came running up and says, please, look at all the trouble she's caused you. No, please, pardon me. And Sayyidina Ali looked at him and says, and he realized he did not care about anybody. He didn't care about the servant girl, no. He only cared about himself and how he would look in the eyes of the Khalifa. And he turned to both of them and said, you see, you come here, you say you're Muslims, but Islam has not entered your heart yet. Its mercy, its goodness, its honesty is far from you. Which action of yours do you think would please Allah? And with that, he walked away. And of course, the servant girl was given the money back to give to her master. But, inshallah, they learned a lesson. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Once there was a sultan, and the sultan found that his royal treasury was being depleted. There was less and less coming in. and he found no solution. He had no idea where the money was going, found no way, no solution to replenish his treasury. And he was in a quandary. And finally he decided, he called one of his messengers and sent him out to one of the wise ones, one of the wise people in that country, a sheikh whom he knew had a lot of wisdom. And the messenger came to the wise one and says, Ya Baba, please tell me, the king sent me. His royal treasury is being depleted, and he wants to know from you what advice you can give him. And the wise one looked at him and was silent. He didn't say a word. And finally he stood up and he walked out the door, not saying another word. Well, finally the messenger says, please, can you then give me a letter, give me something on paper, and advice for the Sultan? And still he didn't say a word. He told him, he gestured to him, and he walked into the garden. And there he picked up his shovel, and he went to a bed of turnips, and he started digging up the big turnips, taking them out and replanting them with little seedling turnips. And then he went to the bed of beets, and he dug up the big beets and replanted them with little seedlings. And so he went around the garden to various vegetable beds, and he dug up the large vegetables and replanted them with seedlings. And then he told the messenger with a gesture to go on his way. Well, the messenger, perplexed, went on his way and came back to the Sultan. And the Sultan said, please tell me, what advice did he give you? And he says, the wise one, he didn't tell me anything. He didn't even give me a letter to give to you or anything on paper, any advice. Well, tell me then, what did he do? He told me he went down to his garden and he started digging up the large vegetables and replanting them with seedlings all over the garden in different beds. Ah, said the king, and he sat there for a while and thought deeply, and suddenly he lifted his head and he went and he dismissed his governors and his tax collectors from all the different provinces in his country. And he replaced them with new, fresh ones that were not known and that were not corrupt and that would bring the taxes back in. And surely, soon after that, the royal treasury was filled again with the money that belonged to it. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. One day Joha, he traveled out into the desert, but in typical Joha fashion. He didn't take enough food and he didn't take enough water. And he traveled on and on. And finally he became thirsty, he became hungry. He was looking around, seeing if there was anything to eat, anything to drink. And finally, there in the distance, there was a small oasis. So he beelined it for that oasis. And finally, as he came to that oasis, he saw this beautiful green oasis. And he was overheated. He was hot. He was sweaty. He walked there. And not only that, there was a Bedouin sitting there in that oasis. And in front of him, he had a big cloth spread out. And on that cloth, there was a big pile of dates. There was a big pile of figs. There was hops there. There was bread there. There was cheese there. There was a big leg of lamb. And he was standing there, hungry because he'd been traveling all day in the desert. And finally, he looked at that and he stood there, with saliva almost coming out of his mouth, and his stomach rumbling and rumbling. And that Bedouin, he kept on sitting there eating and eating and eating. And finally the Bedouin looked up and said, who are you and where did you come from? Me? I'm from your very own people, from your very own place. Good, said the Bedouin. Then tell me, please. Tell me, how is my son Suleiman? Your son Suleiman? He's wonderful. He's a flower amongst the children. Everybody loves him. Well, how's my wife? Please tell me then, how's my wife? Your wife, she's like the full moon. She illuminates everybody, and anybody who has a need comes to her and she gives it to them. Wonderful. Tell me then, how's my dog, my dog, Militant Murat? Ah, your dog, he's fierce. He's become even fiercer. Nobody can come to the house who's not allowed, because he won't let them unless your wife allows them. Well, then tell me, how's my camel Speedy? Ah, your camel Speedy. He's eaten so much, he was eating so much, he's grown another hump. Well, by then, with all this good news that he conveyed to the Bedou, he definitely expected to be sat down and shared his food as was necessary and obligatory according to the laws of hospitality. And his stomach kept rumbling and rumbling louder and louder, but no, there was no invitation forthcoming. And without an invitation, he couldn't sit down. And he stood there waiting and waiting, but no invitation was forthcoming, even though his stomach was louder and louder. Until suddenly, there was a mangy dog that came into the oasis too. And it stood there, looking very disheveled, and its tongue hanging out, panting and panting and panting. And finally the Bedou looked up and says, what kind of dog is that? Ha, no dog, I am not like my militant Murad. Oh no, said Joha, your militant Murad, he was a very, very fine dog. What do you mean was? What do you mean was? Did he die? Did something happen to Murad? Ah, yes. Alas, Murad, he choked while chewing on a bone of your camel Speedy. What do you mean my camel Speedy? He popped off too? Ah, your camel Speedy, alas, he broke his front legs and his necks when he stumbled over the grave of your wife. What do you mean my wife? My wife died? Ah, your wife, yes. She was grieving over your son Suleiman. The house, it fell down and collapsed on your son Suleiman. They brought him out from under the ruins and buried him. At that point, the Bedou had jumped up and he was tearing out his hair and said, terrible news bearer of news bearers, oh misery and woe. And he ran out in the direction where he had come, into the desert, screaming and yelling. And Joha, he sat down behind that cloth and he turned to that mangy dog and he cut off a big piece, that leg of lamb, and handed it over to the dog and turned to it and said, you know, sometimes when there's meanness, meanness is the only means. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Once upon a time there was and there was not, in Central Asia, a sultana. And this sultana, her husband the sultan, had died, and she had one son, a young son for whom she was the regent. But she had one fault. She loved to spoil her son since he was her only son. So he grew up not knowing any good manners. He grew up being spoiled and taking everything for granted. And as he grew up, suddenly the sultana realized his manners were not the manners that the sultan should have. He was taking everything for granted. He was not caring about the people around him. He was only caring about himself and what came to him as the sultan, the future sultan. And she was more and more worried until one day she said to her wazir, our son, he has to be taught a lesson. Please, can you find somebody to be his teacher, to teach him adab, to teach him good manners, so he will be a sultan that the people will look up to. And the wazir went around town and he found an old sheikh, a sheikh that he knew about, who was a wise one. And he called him and says, please, can you come and teach the son of the sultana, our future sultan? Can you teach him? And he came to the palace and he sat with him. But the boy's behavior was so rude that after a short while he realized that his lessons were not fruitful. Finally he turned around and said to the sultana, please, let me take him on a journey. Well, okay, she gave permission to take him on a journey. So he set off with the young boy and they walked for several days until finally they came to a beautiful field, an orchard, and they camped out in that beautiful field along a small stream. And there, as they sat there, suddenly two birds flew up and they flew in a tree next to them. And they started twittering. And the wise one, he looked up at the, at the young man and said, you know, I was taught the language of the animals. And I can tell you what they're saying. Well, of course, the young man, he was very curious and he said, please, please, can you tell me what they're saying? Oh, yes, he said, but I don't know if you want to hear it. It's not very good. He said, please, I want to hear. Tell me, tell me. Well, the first bird, he said, soon in this country, it'll be great for us. Because this young man that's sitting there, he will be a careless and cruel king. And the people will want to leave the orchard of this country, and all the fruit will be hanging off the trees, and there'll be nobody to chase us away, to put scarecrows up or anything like that. And we will be free to eat our fill from this fruit day and night. And the other one, he was saying, well, and when the flocks of locusts come, there will be nobody in the fields to burn and to create smoke to drive the locusts away, and we will be able to feed full on locusts day and night. Well, the young man, he sat there silently thinking, but what was he to say? Well, they traveled on and they went another day and soon they came to the desert. And as they crossing the desert, they came to an oasis in the desert. And as they sat there in the oasis, suddenly 2 camels came. They started drinking from the water in the oasis. And they started grunting and moaning and groaning as camels do. And the young man looked at them and says, please tell me, what are they saying? Let me listen. And he listened. And he said, I don't think you want to hear what they're saying. What are they saying? Of course he wanted to hear. They're saying, this oasis, it'll be useless soon. Because so many people will be wanting to leave this country that is unfruitful. When this young man becomes the future sultan, that all the greenery in this oasis will be trampled. The water will be muddy and there will be barely enough for us to drink when people are leaving this country. And they groaned some more. The young man became more and more silent. And the next day they traveled on, and they traveled again for several days, and they came to a high mountain. And as they were climbing the mountain, suddenly there was an eagle that came and it landed just above them on a crack of rock where his young were, and it screamed and screamed and screamed. And the young man, he looked and said, please, can you tell me what he's saying? Yes, I will. But you won't like it, he said. Well, what is he saying? He said, soon, my young, the eagle said to his young, there won't be any fat lambs to catch in the meadows of this country. There'll be only scrawny ones. There'll be snakes and lizards in the ruins of the capital city because of the sultan who doesn't care about his people and will be having to live on a diet of snakes and lizards instead of fat lambs. And this will happen soon. Unless what? Said the young man. Unless the prince changes his ways and day by day he improves his manners until he will be a sultan that the people will love and will be of benefit to his people. And then this country will flourish. Well, that night was a very, very quiet night. And the young man didn't say anything after that very much. And the next day, the wise man, the sheikh turned to the young man and said, well, I think it's time we return home to the palace. And they did. They slowly journeyed back to the palace. But every day, his manners increased a little bit better. And every day he seemed to care more about the old man, about the people they met, and about everything that went on around him, until finally they came to the capital city, and his manners had greatly improved day by day. And finally, the sheikh, he went to the sultan and said, I think it's good. I think from now on you can find other teachers to teach your son. Because he have learned that in order to be the sultan of a country, he has to be first the sultan of himself. And sure enough, Soon after that, he became the Sultan of that country, and it flourished, and the people loved him, and he was of great benefit to the people. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. There was an old man with 7 sons, and he knew that the end of his life was near. So there was one thing he wanted to do. He called all his 7 sons to him, and he told them the strangest request. Even though they knew he was soon to pass from this world, he told them out, and each of them to get a branch. And they all walked out, and they all found a branch, all his 7 sons, and they came back with him, and each one had a branch. And then he told his oldest son to take his branch and break it. And he broke it easily. And he told his other son to break it, and he broke it easily. And each of them he told to take their branch, and each of them he told them to break it. And one after the other, all 7 of them, they took their branches and broke it. Then again he told them to go out and find another branch, and each one of them went out, and all 7 of them, they found another branch, and they brought them back. And then the old man told his son, one of his sons, he says, tie these branches together as strong as you can. And the young man, he tied all the branches together as strong as he can. And he told his youngest son, now take these and try and break them. And he took the bundle of branches and he tried to break them, but he couldn't. Then he told his second son to join him, and they tried to break it, but they couldn't. And each son, he told him, the third and the fourth and the fifth, each one, he told, to get out that bundle and together to try and break it. Until all 7 stood there trying to break that bundle, and they couldn't. And then he told them to untie it, and each one took a branch, and he told each one to break the branch, and each one broke their own branch again. And he said, you see, this is how it is. Each of you, if you're on your own, you do your own thing, and you do what is of no benefit to others, you're easily to break. But if you stay together, if you stick together, and you be at one, then nothing or nobody can break you. Remember this after I leave this world. This might be of benefit to you. And of course they did. And they stuck strongly together, and they became successful and wonderful people.